Hi, this is Tim Halbach, the warning coordination meteorologist for the National Weather Service at Milwaukee, Sullivan. We've had a lot of questions about some of the damage that occurred last Tuesday, August 28th, up in the Marquette, the Green Lake, Fond du Lac, and Sheboygan County areas. And a lot of tree damage and a lot of damage that occurred that some people thought was tornado damage, and we're questioning why we called it straight line wind damage. So just wanted to give you a little bit of information on some of the things we saw, some of the things that we look for when we're trying to determine whether or not the damage is tornadic or whether or not it's straight line wind. So as of this moment, we've been able to survey 19 tornadoes. Most of those are EF1s. There's been a few zeros and one EF2 which went through the northwest side of Brownsville, and that got our strongest rating there. So just want to go through and talk a little bit about what differentiates between straight line winds and the tornadoes that we saw in the surveys. So a couple pictures here. This was from over by the Alto area. This was a tornado that went through this area here. You can see the barns that were hit, and one of the telltale signs of a tornado is when the debris is lofted up into the air and then taken down in a path downstream from where the tornado went. So as I'll show here, tornadoes have more of an upward motion to them, so when they hit something, it lifts it up into the air. As with straight line wind damage, it's more of a downward force, and it keeps the debris right at where it originated from. So you can see with these two barns here that were hit, the farms here, there's debris that's been lofted up and carried into the field beyond it. Also with the crop damage here, it's all on a path if you look at it going downwind there. So this is my crude third grade sketch of tornadoes versus straight line winds. The tornado has an upward force to it, so that's why you see a lot of things lofted and taken downstream from it. Straight line winds are from a downburst, so it's a downward motion and forces it straight down. I'll show you some examples from these surveys for the two different types that we saw here. So here's aerial footage of a tornado path over by Brownsville from Ben Gulcynski. Hopefully I got that right. But you can see the path here, convergent path going through this farm cornfield here. A lot of times what we'll see is almost like a mohawk with the crops that have been hit by it, showing that convergent path. And you can see it going right through that field there until it gets to the other side. But a convergent path, not widespread or all over the place. You can just see that line there for where that tornado went through. At the ground level, this was an area that we looked at northwest of Cascade that the soybeans here had actually been pulled off of the ground. Some of the plants that were still left there had just basically the outlines of the stems with it, that the leaves and the soybeans have been plucked off of it and then thrown into this forest behind it. Some of this is a little overly dramatic here because they had been driving out into this field and pulling damage or debris from a shed nearby out of it. But if you look at some of the crops along the edges of the soybean damage here, they were all basically plucked off and cleaned from the tornado that was occurring there. If you go a little bit, this is that same site. You can see the field and behind here. There had been a shed that was at this location that the wind got up underneath and then blew all the basically the siding and the roofing material all into this field downstream from where the tornado went through. They found pieces into this forest back here and even into the farm fields beyond here. So that's another sign that we had a tornado there, and this was one of the latest tornadoes that we just confirmed the other day. Now going to the other side of it, the straight line winds, which in this case for August 28th was more impressive than the tornado damage, just because it was so widespread and there was so much damage everywhere that for anybody to be, we've had people ask, and how come this wasn't tornado damage? Straight line wind damage can be as high or higher than what the tornado damage actually was, and we saw a lot of that going from Marquette County all the way over to Sheboygan. So here's some drone video from Clemens over by Oxford and Marquette County. All these trees are blown from west to east. you can see how it's not a path like in that other video there, where you can imagine a straight line wind coming in at 90, 100 miles an hour and knocking over all these trees in one straight motion like this. So it's not a path like how you saw in that other video. It's widespread, just tree damage everywhere. And that's why for our case on August 28th, the straight line winds, in our opinion, were almost worse than some of the tornadic damage that we saw. And that's why a lot of you are still calling and asking us why this wasn't straight line, why this wasn't a tornado. So here's a little schematic of how these straight line winds work, where you get this downburst that happens, that it comes down and almost looks like somebody's come and pushed down everything that's underneath where the wind came from. So some people have said, oh, I've got the circle pattern. Well, that's exactly what can happen with these types of tornadic or straight line winds situation. So some of the things that we look for when we're trying to determine whether or not it's a straight line wind or tornado damage. Another thing that we've heard is, well, my tree was twisted. Well, that's more so based on how the tree fails rather than the type of wind that's hitting it. So trees are not built straight up, or they're not built that when they break that it's going to be a clean cut like a chainsaw went through it. It's more so that the wind pushes on it, and then however the failure is with it, it'll twist off and then fall in one direction. So a sign of a twisted tree is not necessarily a determination that there's a tornado that occurred there. So one last thing we just want to show is the radar from that day. I'll just show one instance, which was by the Brownsville area. And if I zoom out just a little bit, you can take in the whole scope of things. At this point, we had a long line of storms that was moving through Fond du Lac, Dodge County here, and we were getting these spin-ups that were occurring along the leading edge of this, and it's very difficult to see a lot of these tornadoes. We got video from some people that saw these tornadoes in some locations, but what I've got here on the left is the reflectivity, our line of storms here, and then on the right hand side is the velocity. And this is one of the things that we look at for trying to determine whether or not there's a rotation. Can we get a tornado warning out early before it actually is even in contact with the ground? But it also tells us how fast the winds are. So these reds are all motions moving away from our radar, which is to the south, and then these greens are coming towards the radar. And one of the things we saw with a number of these storms were these rotations. Here's Brownsville. You got the pinks, strong winds going away, and then greens coming towards. So we had a pretty strong rotation right here. But then you look back to the west here, these are strong inbound winds. So we had these strong winds coming back behind the storm. So as this tornado occurred and moved through Brownsville and then moved off to the northeast, we then had these very strong northwest to southeast oriented winds that caused all this kind of damage after we'd get these spin-ups occurring. So here's the one that went through Brownsville. The rotation here going off to the northeast, which is why we had a number of tornado tracks that went in that direction. But then just these intense winds going out behind it that came through and caused some significant straight line wind damage with it as well. So that's what we did with this survey. If you have any questions, please let us know and we'll try to answer them for you. If you have had debris that's been lofted and it's an area that we haven't surveyed yet, you can let us know, and if we have time, we'll be able to go out and try to survey that. But from now, we've at least hit the areas where we think we've heard of the tornado damage. So thanks again for listening, and if you have any questions, let us know.